Welcome to Peer Check. I'm your host, Adam Keating, and today we're talking about how and when will MBD take over supply chain. My guests today are Jennifer Herron and Rhiannon Gallagher from Action Engineering, who are experts in MBD, MBE, and almost every hard 3D problem there is in the world, helping engineering teams all over the globe figure out how do you meaningfully make that change while taking a people-first approach. Welcome to the show.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Super excited for you to be here. So before we even get into, the nuts and bolts here, Jennifer, what is MBD?
Ha. Okay, well, MBD, we have an official definition from ASME, which is the American Society for Mechanical Engineers. That definition says it's an annotated model that defines a product without a drawing. Your first question could be, what's an annotated model? And there's lots of ambiguity around what that means. We look at MBD or model-based definition rather than model-based design because that's more of a verb. We're looking at model-based definition as a noun. And it's the ability to have 3D data make a really big impact to a company's bottom line by connecting really typically siloed organizations to communicate better together. So we like to think of it as a noun and really 3D data that will impact the bottom line.
Now, let me ask you this before we even get into the depths of MBD. Where does MBD fit in the overall MBE picture? Like in your perspective, like I like
Yeah,
the focus on the noun and it being a thing, but where does it fit in the bigger landscape?
it's your data. It's the baseline. It's the cornerstone. It's the bottom foundation of the building of the MBE enterprise. And of course, model-based enterprise can get defined with many, many, many different aspects and facets. But if you're building products, then that 3D data is at the core of everything you do. So if it's bad data, you're going to get bad outputs.
Yeah, I've seen it and it's hard and it is a difficult one to get right. Rhiannon, I'm thinking about MBD here. You folks work closely with the customer on like the end user experience and why they're doing this. What are people actually shifting towards MBD for? What are the use cases?
Um, Jennifer talks a lot about complex parts, right? Parts that are really hard to understand if you're go sort of paging through 64 pages of a drawing to really get what that looks like. So more organic shapes, more aerodynamic shapes. Those are
Hmm.
things that make a model sort of sell itself. And people get in and say, "Oh," they don't have to spend 3 days worth of meetings trying to understand what's going on. They can really have a sense of the shape that they're headed toward right away. And there are some mandates starting to come down, from
Hmm.
places like the US DoD is starting to say, hey, step it up. It's time to get modern. They say that they don't put a lot of behind it necessarily, right? They sort
Yeah.
of put it out in the universe and stand back and wait and see what happens. But so there are some customers, bigger customers like Boeing, for example, that are starting to ask for it. There is this sort of DoD mandate that's starting to come up, and there's a lot of young people coming into the job market who have grown up on Minecraft,
Yeah.
and are like, what do you mean? You want me to think in a 2D way? Why would I do that? What, you know? So it helps to sort of appeal to those younger engineers and to, people who have been on computers their whole lives and using 3D for most of it. So,
And I love it when they come and demand the 3D. You know, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's 19 going into manufacturing engineering, and he was like, why do I need to do lean manufacturing, process flow breakdown, and can't we just use this data? Like some of the stuff we're getting ourselves wrapped around the axle with on
Yeah.
all the process details just doesn't make sense. It's really nice to have a fresher perspective on just do it.
I've got a million places I want to go from here. So I want to unpack for sure why people aren't doing it.
Mm,
Because there's lots there's 1,001 excuses for why it's not happening. Because I think the part that's most interesting is it's logical when you think about it in this lens, When the lens is you're building a 3D model because the thing is going to be three-dimensional and all the data is already in there, you only created drawings to communicate. Like the drawing is a communication medium, is all it is. The same way a
Right.
document is a communication medium. Same reason model-based systems engineering is coming into the world to try to make these dynamic models to replace, massive design bases that link to absolutely nothing.
Right.
What do you think are like the couple of top blockers, like tech, people, process, like stuck in their ways? Like, what are the couple of top things that are holding people back from taking what feels like a very clear reality and making it real? And to you first, Jennifer.
Technology's fine. You do have to figure out how you're going to use it. So establishing CAD agnostic processes is a robust strategy because your CAD systems may change out. You may use native data, neutral data. We break it down to the data element levels, geometry annotations, attributes, presentation states, CAD structure. Those data elements can persist in a number of really cool and interesting ways, some of which we know of today, like, first article inspection automation, some of which we do not. Like, let's give the shop floor 3D work instructions, assembly instructions, painting. Rhiannon's hung out with some folks who were really excited about it in the painting booth. And let's see what happens with this really interesting, much more dynamic data. But in short, technology is fine, but you do have to wrap your head around how you're going to use it, and that does take some setup. But then there's the people, which is the other 99% of the problem, and that's Rhiannon's specialty. So
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I was gonna say,
yeah,
Rhiannon, you've spent, you made a career in thinking about how people behave and why we, get on the way we do when things seem so clear. Um,
what is our
you
problem?
know, I would love to say that I'm innocent, but like I think myself, there's been places where I've done things where, 4 or 5 years ago, I used to redline a drawing on paper and not think much more of it than that. And then I get into uh, building Colab, and someone asked me like, "Do you have a printer at Colab?" And I was like, "We've printed probably 3 packs of paper total in 4.5 years."
Same.
Like that's like how little we actually print anything. So I'm curious from the people side, Rhiannon, what are the key things that are stopping people from doing this? Is it fear? Is it stuck in the ways? Is it generational? What is actually the psychology behind people getting stuck here?
Yes. I mean, I think part of it is that the engineers, there's a value around the new, right? And it is a kind of cognitive bias, the bias toward the new that says that if it's newer, it's better. And engineers can tend to have that bias. Quality people tend not to have that bias, right? Like they're not, just because something's new doesn't make it compelling for everybody. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really hard for the engineers that are trying to put this stuff in place to understand. Like, well, why don't you want to do the newest and latest? Because it doesn't feel safe, because it isn't using their skill set that they've already got. When we talk about motivating people, we talk about mastery, autonomy, and purpose, right? So for engineers, sometimes the purpose of doing the new thing is enough, but that's not necessarily true for
Mm-hmm.
everybody. You got to find something else. And then on mastery sort of has two pieces, right? There's do I get to learn a new skill? That's part of
Mm-hmm.
mastery. And that's a key part of mastery. If you want to keep people motivated at their jobs, you want to sort of keep on pushing their edges a little bit, but you have to push it with these sort of Goldilocks tasks that are just a little outside their comfort zone, not,
Mm-hmm.
and now we're going to throw away everything you spent 30 years learning and and do it in a new way. And so I think sometimes people people's mastery motivation goes down a lot because they feel like you aren't acknowledging the skills that they already have. People are very proud of being able to take those 120 pages and assess it and turn it into something 3D. There's magic there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're almost taking away that magic that they're really, really proud of. And so there is a little bit of generational element, right? The longer that you've been building up that skill set, the
Mm-hmm.
more you want to make sure it's acknowledged. But the truth is that they have a whole bunch of other skills that we can acknowledge as we transition them. And so that's a lot of what we talk about. and what they find is, like my painting guys, my painting guys are like, just make me have to talk to engineers less. Like it was all about autonomy for them. Like, I don't want to keep
Yeah.
having to ask where, what needs to be masked and which surface needs to, I don't want to keep having to ask that. I just want to be able to
Yeah.
figure it
Why
out.
would you? Yeah.
And giving them the model gave them the ability to figure it out. So then their autonomy motivation goes way up, and they're really proud of themselves because they can do it all themselves and they don't have to talk to engineers anymore, which they didn't want to do in the first place. So,
I, I actually, so I was going to ask you, my head was going to, very similar people are in the software world as the hardware world, like humans at the elemental level.
Yeah.
They're not that different,
For
but
sure.
they have interest in building engineering type related projects and solving problems. But the cultures are completely different. And I was actually going to ask you a culture, but as you started going deeper there, you took me to something that I don't think I've ever thought of before is the difference. But I think one of the key differences might actually be that in software, the people who would get this new thing, there is no like job security risk like really there. It's largely just the next technology and it's important. But in the engineering world, it's different roles. Like these are different people. There are actually drafters. There are people who are in quality. There are people who are on the production floor. It's a whole bunch of different actors who have different levels of it. So like the engineer who, doesn't really care for the drawing is cool with pushing it because they don't want to make the drawing. There's other people who actually have built their career on that, and it's a full shift. It's no longer just like everyone does
Right.
25% different. It's like some people do 5% different and just less work, and then others have to learn a whole new career. Like, is that directionally correct? Like, when you were saying that, that's where my mind exactly went. I was like,
yeah.
I've never thought about it at that level from like the roles, but
Tell them about
is that what you're
psychological
seeing?
safety.
Yeah, walk me through this.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I think there is an element of psychological safety, right? You have to, when you talk about psychological safety, there's inclusion level safety, and the next level up from that is learner level safety. Are people
Okay.
safe enough to say, hey, I don't know how to do that? That's not clear to me. And when you have these great big manufacturing organizations, that can feel really insecure to say, hey, I don't know how to do that, let alone getting all the way up through the tiers. The next one is um, contributor safety. Can I say, hey, I think there's a better way to do that, and then the final one is challenger safety. um, Wait, why are we doing it this way? you
Mm-hmm.
know and so different people in different roles also have different levels of psychological safety, and that's part of it. But I think the other part that you're alluding to is that an engineer is still working on the same computer at the same desk. you know the file looks different, the part looks different, same desk,
Mm-hmm.
same computer. My paint guys had never worked on a computer before. They had never had a computer in their part of the factory before, because for a whole bunch of really good reasons, right?
Yeah.
Like the idea of having like all those processing chemicals and a computer. And the older you get, the more expensive and fragile computers feel, you know? So they're afraid to break them. They're afraid to touch them. They're worried about them because in their mind, it's a really expensive piece of equipment.
Right.
And so you have to introduce a computer to them a lot of times. Very few companies are doing the digitalization step separate from the 3D step that we work with. Most of them are taking the 3D step at the same time that they're taking the digital step. Not all of them. We have some that have said, okay, everything's going to go digital, and you're going to look at the 2D drawings digitally as well. But often you're
Mm-hmm.
making both of those leaps at the same time. And that leap to computers has a whole bunch of baggage for a lot of people that engineers aren't used to, haven't thought about, and don't see.
Yeah, and COVID force fed this too a little bit. Like we
Yeah.
Yep.
saw it, that teams that were all on paper and at best in like desktop tools, all started trying to figure out how to, access from a central repo, how to talk to each other online, how to work from home. And in some ways, I think that was one of the best things that ever happened for, getting a step in the right direction. And now it's like the next step's a little more ambitious. The next one's like a massive transformation because if you think about what leaders are saying, if you read the top, innovators annual reports about what their goals are, automotive companies are saying we want to go from 54 and 60-month development windows to sub 40. Like they've been doing 54 and 60 for decades, and now they're just going to cut out 2 years.
How?
And you look at How, right? Like, because
How?
if you read the rest, if you read the rest of the report, it talks about it in, percentages that are like tens,
Yeah.
right? Tens of percentages does not cut out 2 years of work. And I actually spoke to one of like the top product companies in the world, and they were telling me some of their most innovative products take 5 to 6 years to build,
Yeah.
and their goal is to get down to 1 to 2 years. And I said, how? Like, you can't just expect to make what you're currently doing a little bit better. That's going to result in maybe like 4.5 years. You need like a radical change so that people focus on something different and behave differently.
Well, and it has to be a process change and it has to be a team change because
Yeah.
it takes 10 years to build a spacecraft. It's hard to send things to space, but in
Yeah.
general, it takes 10 years to build a spacecraft. How do you do that in less time? Well, you change what you're doing today. If you're unwilling to change the way you're doing business today, forget about it. You can't just throw in a piece of technology and expect change to occur. That's insanity.
And you can't, this thing is not staying in. You can't expect it on a linear scale. I think that that's
Right.
the other problem
It's
is
timey
that,
wimey wibbly wobbly.
yeah, they assume they go out and they make these
Hmm.
commitments, we're going to get it from 2 years to 2 months or whatever. And then, but
Right.
what they don't take into account is that there's this J curve that happens with all new
Yeah.
technology where everything slows down for a while. And you're in what they call the pit of
Hmm.
despair, right? Like
Yeah.
everything sucks for a bit and everything takes longer for a little bit. And they don't build in tolerance for that transition
Yeah.
period. And then they sort of get to the bottom and give up. If they had hung with
I
it for a little while longer, it would have gotten more
And now
efficient.
you can tell that Rhiannon and I were in high school in the 80s
Right.
because we made a Princess Bride and Doctor Who reference all in one sentence.
Exactly.
I, I also love that you worked in. They didn't build in the tolerance, because if you asked them if they're going to do with their product, they certainly would. And with their
Yeah.
process and their people, they certainly don't.
Yeah.
And that seems a little hypocritical in most respects, right?
Right.
Like, uh, we were actually just talking about internally. Tech is getting a lot of love, but the trouble is making these changes because of how long we've been without them. Is that pit of despair is a little deeper
Oh, it's
in the
enormous
manufacturing
pit of
world
despair.
than it is for software.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like, just on that, like, I think people from this, there's a lot of psychology behind this. There is like an understanding needs to happen. There's an emphasis on people and process. But why, like, MBD itself is probably the easier starting point because it's tangible, right? You can picture what it is, you can see it and get it. Why should leaders think about doing this? Like, what is the actual value? Obviously, I just talked about time to market, but what is the core value that when you talk to someone, people actually latch on and say, okay, I'm willing to go into the pit of despair with you, Jennifer, and hopefully come out the other end with enough tolerance and bandwidth that we survived.
I think this is the burning question, right? Why are we doing this? Are we doing it because it's new and it's cool? Not particularly
Hmm.
motivating in the long run and doesn't necessarily prove the business value. Um, in my mind, we do it because we are trying to mathematically define and digitally define the data in a way where we take out the redundancy of manual data reentry. That's probably number one, because there are obviously accuracy errors in that problem, and it's labor intensive. Um, so that's probably number one to me, is reusing the digital data as it makes sense within the organization. But that's kind of a cold, computer-based way of looking at things. And I think what Rhiannon has discovered when she works with people who actually have to use the data is that there's some really interesting things that we weren't really aware of from 3D navigation. Oh, I can turn the model around. I don't have to look at just your little flat, stupid orthographic view that you gave me, Adam, that you thought was a good view. Yeah. Is it the right one? I don't know. And I think looking at that opportunity of blending the reuse aspects with the reducing overall cognition and improving people's quality of life at their job is probably the bigger draw and the bigger picture. Now, how you blend all that together into an ROI story is hard.
It is, and it like the part I think it's hard now, um, but it's the same thing. I always like I made this LinkedIn post a while ago about software developers if they were out taking screenshots of code and downloading it and redlining it and putting it back into the system and doing that, like they'd all quit. And I think that's fundamentally true. But like 20 years ago or 25 years ago, that might not have been seen as worth fixing. But like, can you imagine the pace at which our whole team would quit for sure if I told them they had to do that, because it's just so ineffective, right? It feels foolish,
Yeah.
but we're doing that on a massive scale in manufacturing, and it's because it's been hard. There hasn't been technology forever. There's been a whole bunch of blockers. The cloud was not accepted. 3D in the browser, as an example, really is only the last decade that you can really do much with it. So like a lot of these things were limitations, but those things aren't true anymore. Like, not the same situation. And I'm just thinking like specific use case. You've mentioned a couple times about supply chain. That's where we see it
Yeah.
the most often, is that people don't want to be cutting drawings for fab shops that they already have in their CAD model that are fully defined, but the supply chain is struggling to pick it up because they don't have the license, they don't know how to view it, they don't know how to interpret whatever it is.
And the data isn't as good as they think it is. That's the
Right,
other, because it's not fully
right.
defined. The author needs to increase fidelity and process standardization on how they're doing it.
So how do we tackle the supply chain part? Because to me, that's where it's going to live or die. If it doesn't work there, you are going to always have to create drawings. There's no other way around it because someone's got to build the thing at the end, and if they can't read or interpret it, or they don't want to, they aren't going to build it. So how do we fix that problem? Where do we start on supply chain?
I have so many gripes, so I'm going to let Rhiannon take it first.
I was like, okay, here she goes.
Exactly.
I mean, part of it always is psychologically that people get into habits with the processes that they already have. And so they don't recognize the inefficiencies, like, oh, well, yeah, it takes 64 steps, but it always takes 64 steps. It's like, yeah, but I can show you how it could take 13 steps. What would you do with that spare time? I think part of the case that you make to supply chain is the case that we generally make to quality, which is we know it's your neck on the line. We know that everybody's making you feel like the bottleneck, right? And if we can reduce that redundancy by giving you digital data that's consistent so that you're not spending your entire life typing things in and analyzing and typing things in and analyzing and redlining and analyzing, and we can free you up to make your deadlines. We can reduce scrap because you're going to get it right the first time because people are going to understand what they're actually looking at, and that's reducing scrap is a big deal for supply chain, especially in the world in which we apparently live now, right?
Where we have supply chain
getting them right the
problems.
first time becomes really important. And that, like when Jennifer talks about that first article inspection efficiencies, like I know I can make a QA guy cry. Like, oh, really? Oh, that took you 3 weeks, huh? Oh,
80% time savings.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's ironic. I mean, I spoke to a team today, and they asked me like relatively like how fast was their design review process relative to what we see across the industry. Given we work with a lot of teams on this, and I was like, depends on what you're doing, but it ranges from some of our customers doing multiple iterations on the same product in the same day to some taking 2 months between revs.
Yeah.
And the complexity of the product's not that dissimilar. And it's like, there's a bit of a disparity there. When you think about supply chain in particular, I think that's also true. There's some people who are way ahead, a lot that's way behind. I'm curious from your perspective, like on the human front, talk about people. Does this change start with the supplier themselves? It feels like there's pressure from the top, but like the human side, does it need to be the supplier's psychology first? Because it feels like that's where it rubber hits the road.
That's where it's hardest on so many levels, right? And it depends on the scale of, we say supply chain as if it's this big monolith and everybody's the same size, right? But there's a big difference between the 25-person mom and pop shops, and your 1,500-person shops that can crank it out. They have to have usually more than one customer asking for it, because they're going to have to put computers into their places. They're going to have to train their people up. That's a leap that you're asking for. I think I think it's great to say that it should start there, but we have to make it feel efficient for them. We have to incentivize it. And I don't think that the software tools are doing a great job of incentivizing it yet, and really telling that story. Because right now, there's so much variation in the suppliers.
Yeah.
How many customers they have, how many customers are asking for it, how much they can take on at a time, whether it's worth losing your business and just walking away if they can't do models. It's going to vary tremendously.
The places where we've seen the most success is where the supply chain departments or organizations or managers are involved on the authoring level. So those that are creating the data, right, at the authoring level, if those supply chain managers get the level of change that's required for the suppliers, then they can start to work within their supply chain contracts, conversations, and build up trust to shift the change.
Right.
Because in general, suppliers don't trust the data that comes from the authoring organizations or the engineering department, even if it's an internal situation. And so that trust is already not there because they expect bad data. So then they're already starting to manufacture. And so from a psychological safety perspective, that's a problem. And I'll throw something out there for Rhiannon, but I mean, it's about establishing a core value of trust and then having that respectful collaboration out there. And it could be a mismatch of values if it doesn't work across that procurement chasm, because sometimes it's a chasm and sometimes there's a nice bridge that goes back and forth. If you have a nice bridge, this transition is much simpler. If you are already in kind of a bad trust situation with your suppliers, then they're going to be like, great, you're going to give us another piece of crappy data? Great. I don't care. It's 2D, 3D, or 4D. It doesn't matter. I still have to do all these crazy checks and balances. Your contracts are 50 pages long.
Yeah. But also don't underestimate suppliers. We've also had very small suppliers. We've come in and said, okay, we're going to start giving you 3D data. And they'll say, oh, thank goodness, because we've been taking your stupid 2D drawings and converting them to 3D. I mean, the other thing to think about is that the more that they start to get into additive manufacturing as suppliers, the more compelling the 3D is going to be, because the additive manufacturing is going to drag them into it, whether they're ready for it or not.
And it's going to just keep moving that way. It's actually a really interesting way to look at it. Like, it's not you said earlier, it's not linear in terms of that process. There's going to be a pit of despair. I think it's also not linear across suppliers at all, even within the same supply chain, because of the size, because of the maturity, because of the use case. Like, I think additive is a great example of a place where, there's not a whole lot of value in a drawing if you're going to ship that to a 3D printer and have it printed. But I think the more we can think that way about manufacturing other things and being really clear, I agree. Like, the software today is like, it can do it, but it's not easy, and people don't know why and how, and that part hasn't gotten clear yet. Because every time someone even receives something from us, like, we're not even thinking about MBD right now on that level. It takes that first second to say, what am I doing here? And what is this going to be? What is the value for me? And I think the second that becomes clear, that's, hey, you don't need to download anything. You don't need to do much. It's going to walk you through how to build this thing. You have all the information you need. You need to have a conversation. It's there. Like, all those things. Then people start to say, okay, it's worth the cognitive load to switch away from, because the first few times it's going to be weird. Like, that's just the short answer. Like, it's going to be strange. It's going to be uncomfortable. But I want to come back to just a practical step there, because I've seen it be tried multiple ways. You alluded to earlier, like Boeing, DoD kind of pushing a standard. I think you also just said a second ago the opposite, which is like finding that bridge where the chasm's not so great, and building that first relationship almost together to build trust.
Yes.
Which end of that spectrum do you think is going to win this battle? Like, which one is going to be the one that actually makes the change?
The ones that come together.
Well, yeah, and I think the ones that understand, from a psychological standpoint, it's going to come down to the ones that understand where to start the conversation. one of the biggest
Mhm.
mistakes that we see people make is they start with like a really complex part that's got a bunch of weldments on it and takes a lot of machining and maybe don't start there. Maybe start with assemblies. Maybe start with paint and process. Start with a part of the
Mhm.
process where this is the value add is enormous. The time savings
Yeah.
is enormous. Don't start with the hard ones, you know. Like, so sometimes it's going to come
I
down to
actually really
that.
like. I think
So
I think
true.
in software, yeah, software implementation we try that, but that's actually really practical on the product level. Like to think about what is the delta between like difficulty and the highest value, and find the right one that gets the balance of like lowest difficulty, highest value, because that's what people will remember. And we've got a couple of groups we work with that I think have found that. Like they found with their supplier that they just found a good relationship,
Yep.
almost co-developed what it should feel like, so that the next supplier doesn't get absolutely surprised by the experience that they're going to get. I think it's a bit of a yin and a yang here. We're going to have coming down from the top in some supply chains, you got to do this, and then we're going to have on the other side, people are going to start demanding that it happens at the company level, at the supplier level, because it just is better. Um, but like just to wrap this all back into it, thinking about the psychological side, I want to think about just like the future here. We're talking about things that some companies on like the maturity model are very infant, some who are way ahead. I'm curious, Jennifer, from your perspective. First question is, do you think we will ever get away fully from drawings? Ever?
No, because
Rhiannon, what about you?
there are some things, take a schematic for instance, or a washer, that
Yeah.
flat out make more sense in 2D. Um, that doesn't mean you don't have a 3D representation of a washer,
Hmm.
because I absolutely want you to. Um,
Hmm.
but why start there? Why would you
Yeah.
throw yourself on your sword for something that already works really well in 2D and you don't have any business value? So, and the reason I say no is that it's just not important to get rid of 2D drawings. What's important is to get the value out of the 3D data as best you can. Because I've seen people get time and time again flummoxed by, well, we can't make it all completely digital and we can't make it all completely eliminate the 2D drawings. I'm like, okay, so you're going to throw out your 80% savings because of
Yeah.
one part family? That's crazy talk. And it's not practical and it's not the way people do business.
Yeah, it's a progress over perfection kind of
Absolutely.
mindset here. And if you look at anything, I say it's about work in general. If you do 90% of the work, it usually takes 50% of the time, and the last 10% always takes 50% as well.
Right.
And there's a diminishing return on that last
Yes.
10%, which is why most people should just ship the thing way before 90. Safety and quality, there's a
Trump
threshold for
that.
making
Yeah,
sure that
right.
works, but
Right.
Exactly.
we include that disclaimer out there, but
Yeah.
in broad strokes, those
Yeah.
things checked off, the last 10% is kind of useless most times and uh, really doesn't return anything. But I'm going to turn the second question to you, Rhiannon. Thinking about MBD, I've seen the spectrum of like drawing only, drawing with model supporting, model with drawing supporting, model only, with obviously fully defined MBD. When do you think we get to the end of that spectrum where it's model predominantly driving manufacturing? Are we talking a year, 10 years, 20 years? Like, what's your perspective? You're to make a prediction. What's your call?
Oh, wait, yeah, it's going to depend on how, frankly, it depends on how you do those intervening steps. We see way too many people who do the intermeeting, who think that minimally dimensioned model is sort of an intermediate step, and then people don't have the information they need, and they get burnt out on models overall, and then they decide they're never going to do it, and then it's going to take 15 years. You know, if you're careful about how you build in those intervening steps, I think we can get there a lot faster. But it's you can really sabotage yourself by
Well, and I'll
handing somebody a model
answer,
they can't use.
yeah, I'll answer with my future protection is we're done already. I've been in my career for 26 years. I got my bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering 26 years ago. I never didn't use a model. from the get-go.
Yeah.
Never. We're already using the model. What we're doing is a bunch of gyration crazy
Extra
steps in
work.
between
Yeah.
because we think we should.
Yeah. Yeah, I respect that. And I'm going to go back to the last part here. You folks work across all different industries. You've seen all different sizes. Which vertical of manufacturing do you think is going to get there to the most practical value adding space first? Like who is winning this race? Industry specific.
I'm gonna wait and see what Jennifer says on this one.
The short story is nobody is winning a race because it's not a race.
No, okay. So what's your perspective? Is someone leading the charge? Is there no urgency around it all? What's your take on the shift?
The people that are making successes at it are doing it quietly, and
Mm.
they're doing it with a lot of fanfare, and they're just getting the savings and pocketing it.
Yeah, there's a lot of that happening. Like people do it and they discover how much they're saving and how much, you know, you know, they're saving time, they're saving scrap, and they're not going to tell anybody else that they're doing that. You know,
Yeah,
why give away that secret? You know, be like kind of
that's
giving somebody
interesting.
their lean profile and saying, "See, here's what you need to do. You just need to move this over here." No.
It's so funny though because it's so screamed out in the public.
Yeah.
But it goes into an ether like 9 times out of 10. It kind of goes into the ether until you imagine and feel it. And you know what? Like Microsoft Teams is not quite the same level of transformation, but I feel like that was like not that dissimilar. Chat apps were around forever before the entire manufacturing world switched to Teams because they
Right.
had to. And can you imagine asking one of them now to go back to, I don't even know what they were using. Like I had a company tell me the other day they were on Lotus Notes, and I was like, oh my God,
Oh
like
yeah, I know who that is.
how is it even possible? Like
Yeah.
Yeah.
it'd be just as well that I get Jennifer on a pager to
Yeah.
try and have a conversation,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Well, and it's,
so
you know, we've
that's
had that
that's actually a good
conversation with them
perspective.
too. You know, we've said, "Oh, look at you. You didn't think you could do major transformations. Huh. You proved
Right?
yourself wrong." You know.
Yeah.
But I think, and there's also some interesting
So
data
there's
coming out about we had worried about change fatigue for a long time, and like with all this upheaval, does it really make sense to change it now? Right? Is there, but the
Mhm.
incentives for making the supply chain more efficient are so compelling. And actually, the psychology is coming out
Yeah,
that actually, you know, while people are disrupted, disrupt them a little bit more, they'll be okay. You know, so don't be afraid
Yeah.
to make
yeah.
this change at the same time that you've made all these other ones, and, you know, in the middle of this chaos that we've got.
But I got one last question. I agree with what you just said completely. How do you think the current like economic climate plays into that? Do you think teams are still going to invest during this downturn, or is it just going to be the best teams who are most forward looking that do it, and the rest fall behind another year or two?
Do you think they've invested during this downturn? I'm not sure I see that. I think they're trying to doggy paddle and stay above water. That's what I've seen.
Do you think that's gonna like my perspective on this, and I've been thinking a lot about it because obviously we're in the venture capital world of software building. There is some conservatism that you need to have so that you're being smart about survival, of course. But there's also this part, like in some industries, there is a race. Maybe MBD is not a race, but the electric vehicle industry, as an example, that is a race. Like that is 100% a race, and there are certain people that are winning and certain that are not. And you choose to take 2 years to go a little slower, that delta becomes a 10-year window based on the pace companies are going. And I'm like, I'm curious to see how that turns out. Like, if people really keep pushing through and investing in initiatives now, or if it really does kind of slow. Because during COVID, it didn't. During COVID, people actually felt like they kept moving after the first 2 months of panic. But I don't
I don't
know.
think that's true for everyone. I,
Fair.
yeah, yeah. I think it depends. It depends on a lot of factors.
Hmm.
I do know that there was software purchases and people made a lot of good software purchases in the 3D data interoperability space.
Hmm.
But that's not the same as making a transformation and making process change and investing in training, investing in upskilling, investing in redoing the way you do business. I'm not sure I see anybody investing in redoing the way they do business today to really impact that firefighting of the supply chain crisis. Um, I don't know, Rhiannon, what do you think? Do you think people are investing on that?
Well,
I'm
I'm
not
going to
convinced.
talk systems thinking for a second, right? I mean, people are reacting to an event, right? They aren't looking
Yeah.
for
Mm-hmm.
patterns. They aren't looking for structures. They're sort of in a reaction mode right now. Um, I think that there are probably some who are reacting as in terms of moving toward an innovative thing, feeling like they need to innovate. I think that there's been a lot of upheaval around who's in charge, and sometimes it takes a new vice president coming
Mm-hmm.
in who says, "Ta da! Here's my legacy." you know, I
Yeah.
think there's probably some of that happening a little bit, um, but yeah, there's just so much uncertainty that it's easier to focus on the very top of the iceberg and not really look any deeper. And this stuff, to succeed at this
Yeah.
stuff, you really have to be willing to look
Yes.
deeper.
The water. Yeah, I think it's a fair point that you made too, Jennifer. Like, I think there's been decisions to do things, but I've seen it too, where it might be very surface level and it's not right to the root. I actually like that iceberg analogy of like, we might have chipped a few pieces off the top of the berg, but they're still 90% below. And those types of changes didn't happen. I think you're right in saying that. Microsoft Teams is a pretty surface level change when you didn't have a
It
chat tool, right?
it
Like, that's
is,
not
but I
a,
mean, it could be that Microsoft Teams is the reason that all of a sudden you have computers on your factory floor, and then maybe that
yeah,
alone is enough of a separation of introducing the computer and introducing the model. Like
start.
that could happen. Because
Yeah, I've actually said it a million times that I think Microsoft Teams, as much as it feels simple to me because I've been on Slack for almost a decade, I think it was one of the most important things that happened because it's made people talk to each other. It's made people
Yeah.
expect better tools and behave digitally in a way that wasn't painful. Like, I think that was the success, is that Teams wasn't painful, and that was sort of the win. One thing that came back through this whole conversation that I thought was interesting to wrap up on, talked a lot about psychological safety, talked a lot about understanding how it works, talked a lot about just thinking about where this all fits. You use the word trust a
Mm.
couple of times, and we talk about building companies. But I can't help but feel like the main thing we're talking about here in the end is trust, whether it's trusting the data,
Yep.
trusting your partner,
Yep.
trusting that it's worth the change or the process. Like, everything you said came back to that. And it's such an elemental thing,
Yeah.
and not talked about enough. Like, I don't ever talk to an engineer directly about trust,
That would
although
be
they'll tell
hard
me,
because they're staring
yeah,
at each other's shoes at the same time. So unless you're looking eye to eye, it's kind of hard to establish trust. But yeah,
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 it's a tough one. So, anyways,
trust is hard.
I'll be contacting you folks to come figure that one out for us on top of MBD and MBE. You'll be now the trust experts as well. Um, Jennifer, Rhiannon, I really appreciate the time today. I think this was an incredible conversation. I think there's a lot left to do in this journey. I think you know just as well as I do. But we're appreciative to have people like you dissecting this and helping us get there. So thank you so much for joining the show
thank
today.
you.
Thanks, Adam. We appreciate your fresh eyes.